The second point I wanted to make is the wider context of the papacy of Pope Francis. And this, I think, is very important for us to keep in mind. He has made and continues to make the call to mercy the heart of his mission as our present successor of St. Peter. And I think this was crystallised in his decision to call the Year of Mercy. And unless we remember that, and unless we remember the two synods that were called precisely to look at marriage and family in the context of the Year of Mercy, and unless we remember that this is written very much in the context of the Year of Mercy, I think we run the risk of misunderstanding not just this, but the whole of the Pope's understanding of what the Lord is asking of him. I have a conviction about this, and it is that the Holy Spirit has inspired the present Holy Father to identify mercy as that divine quality or characteristic, if I can use those anthropomorphic terms, that divine quality or characteristic which the Church in our particular times is called to rediscover, contemplate more deeply, and to begin to practice more fully. It's not the only thing the Church has to do, but I think we've been given a Pope who, under the inspiration of the Spirit, has been called to remind us that at this moment in our history, this is what the Church particularly needs. And if that's true, then we have to face the fact that maybe the Lord is trying to tell us that we've allowed other things to so dominate our life in the Church and our understanding of the Church that the quality of God's mercy has somehow or other been obscured or pushed aside, and it's time that we rediscovered it. The Pope's oft expressed insistence, for example, and the priests here among us will know what I'm talking about here, his often expressed insistence that going to confession shouldn't be like going to a torture chamber. He would only be able to say that either because he's experienced going to confession himself as a torture chamber, or he's heard a whole lot of other people telling him that's what their experience is. And of course, that's not what the sacrament of reconciliation is meant to be. So the fact that he talks about these things points to his conviction anyway, that somehow or other some of us have lost our way a little bit in terms of our understanding of the Church. The fact that he so often, and he does it again in here, talk about the Church as a place, as a field hospital where people's wounds are healed and people's hearts are warmed, is a call to each one of us to ask ourselves, is that how I've experienced the Church in my life? Is that the dominant image I carry in my life of the Church? As a place where I can go and have my wounds healed and my heart's warmed? And how am I at being a contributor to a Church that is experienced that way by others? All of this, I think, is calling us to a certain humility in the life of the Church at the moment, a certain recognition that although we are, in theory, the body of Christ, the universal sacrament of salvation, all of those wonderful things that we say about the Church that we are in theory, how are we about being those things in practice? Are we really, as a Church, a powerful and living and unambiguous and attractive instrument of God's mercy in people's lives? I think that's what the Pope is trying to call us to do. And I think one of the reasons why Amoris Laetitia has been a little bit challenging for people is precisely because it calls us to be humble about the Church, and we're not always used to being humble about the Church. To recognise that maybe in the way we've gone about living our Christian life in the Church, we've obscured the face of the Church for many people, is a bit of a confronting thing for us to have to face. But certainly, and Tom mentioned it in the introduction, the reality that all of us are having of living through the experience of the Royal Commission, and even more fundamentally the experience of the terrible tragedy and scandal of sexual abuse in our church, all of that should be enough to convince us that we have, in all sorts of ways, obscured the face of Christ. So I've spent a long time establishing the context, and I'm probably running out of time now to do the rest of what I wanted to do, but I do think the context is important. And even if I finished now and sent you all home to read this yourselves before going to bed, I'd still be asking you to have those contextual things in your mind. Because if we just come to it cold and don't have all of those reflections also in our minds and hearts, I think we're going to miss this document and its meaning very much. Let me, though, turn now to the document, at least for a little while. First thing to say about it is it's a very long document. And Pope Francis himself acknowledges that it's a very long document. It's also interesting to note that he addresses it to bishops, priests and deacons, consecrated persons, Christian married couples, and all the lay family. This document is addressed to the Catholic community, precisely as a community of disciples who are called to live in fidelity to their Lord. So it's addressed to all of us. I'm sure Pope Francis hopes that lots of other people will read it and gain benefit from it, but this document, unlike some of the things that the Pope writes or speaks, is addressed specifically to us. And right at the start, he counsels us not to undertake what he calls a rushed reading of this text. This is a document that needs careful reflection and pondering. He even suggests that we leaf through it first at the start and work out which of the chapters are of particular interest to us and maybe start there, and then having done that, to branch out into some of the other sections. So he suggests that married couples might be particularly interested in chapters 4 and 5, that priests and deacons might be particularly interested in chapter 6, and that everybody will probably be interested in the infamous chapter 8. So right at the start, I think he's also making a plea for the humility I mentioned a moment ago. He's asking us to come to this document with this sense of humility. And I just wanted to quote something at the start. He's talking about the discussions that went on in the Synod Hall during the two synods. The Synod process, he says, allowed for an examination of the situation of families in today's world, and thus for a broader vision and a renewed awareness of the importance of marriage and the family. And then what he says next is important. The complexity of the issues that arose revealed the need for continued open discussion of a number of doctrinal, moral, spiritual, and pastoral questions. So there's the first challenge. Are we open to discussion on doctrinal, moral, spiritual, and pastoral questions? Or would we be inclined to say, well, okay, spiritual maybe, pastoral, I guess, but certainly not open to any discussion on doctrinal or moral questions. That's all settled. That's all done and dusted. The Pope is challenging us to be a little open to the possibility that there may be more for us to discover about the doctrinal teachings of our church and about the moral teachings of our church. We won't discover they're wrong, but we might discover there's more to them than we had understood. And then he goes on to say, the thinking of pastors and theologians, if faithful to the church, honest, realistic, and creative, will help us to achieve greater clarity. And behind that is the suggestion that we don't have absolute clarity on everything yet at the moment. We need to be open to achieving greater clarity. And then he makes an interesting comment. The debates carried on in the media, in certain publications, and even among the church's ministers, range from an immoderate desire for total change without sufficient reflection or grounding, that's one end of the scale, to an attitude that would solve everything by applying general rules or deriving undue conclusions from particular theological considerations. Can you see what I mean when he's inviting us to be a little bit humble and a little bit open to the possibility that we might still have a bit to learn about some of these things? I think that's a really important and can be a rather challenging thing for us. It really raises in my mind the question of something that when I was a lecturer in theology I used to reflect on a lot and teach courses about, and that is the development of doctrine in the church. It's been the case from the very beginnings of Christianity that the church has been caught up in deepening, under the guidance of the Holy Spirit, deepening its understanding of the revelation made to us in and through Jesus. As Cardinal Newman points out in his writings on this question, where there's no development, we don't have life, we have death. Newman used the analogy of the human person, so let me use the same analogy. I look very different now to the way I did 60 years ago when I was 3 years old. If my baby photos were here, and I certainly wouldn't be bringing them to show any of you, but if they were, you might not even recognise that it's the same person. There's been a great deal of change taking place. Had there been no change, you would be looking at a very odd-looking 63-year-old standing up here if I looked the same as I did when I was 3. So there's been a great deal of change taking place, but I was Tim Costelloe when I was 3, and I'm Tim Costelloe now that I'm 63. I'm the same person, although there's been enormous development and change. What could never have happened was that I could have at some stage stopped being the human person Tim Costelloe and instead developed into some form of non-human life. So you can see the difference between development and sameness. That things are expressed differently today to the way they were in the past, or that we see things with more clarity or greater depth now than we did in the past, doesn't betray or doesn't point to a betrayal of the past, but a fidelity to the past. No development, no life, was the principle on which Cardinal Newman based so much of his thinking. Underneath the undeniable change, there has been a fundamental continuity and identity. Development of doctrine follows that rule. And so it's important to say what was once true cannot now be untrue. But our understanding of the rich depths of truth, what a particular truth might now be calling us to, how it might be better explained and understood in our contemporary world, all of these things are important and need to be considered. And they're the kinds of things we need to bring to our reading of this document, and I would say particularly to our reading of the chapter 8, which has proven to be the most controversial of all of the chapters. I want to say a few words about chapter 8, not too many, because I don't think it's meant to be at the heart of the Pope's thinking. He didn't think, I'll write chapter 8 and then write everything else around it just as kind of fill-in. He wants us to understand the whole document, but being human beings, we tend to zoom in on the things that are a little bit challenging and that we can sort of get our teeth stuck into. So let me just point out a couple of quick things that I think are really worthwhile in some of the other chapters, but really you need to read it for yourselves. The first chapter is based on the scriptures. It's centred around humanity as being created in the image and likeness of God, and this is fundamental for a Christian understanding of the human person, for Christian anthropology. So many of the issues with which our contemporary world grapples come down to the question of the particular anthropological view you take of the human person. The Christian anthropological view, the Christian worldview, if I can put it that way, is based firmly in the scriptures and then in the church's ongoing tradition, and particularly in the first chapters of the book of Genesis, interpreted in the light of the incarnation and interpreted in the ongoing teaching of the church. Because remember, for us, and I'm quoting Gaudium et Spes from Vatican II here, Jesus Christ, fully reveals us to ourselves and brings to light our most high calling. If you want to know what the human person is really meant to be and is really meant to be all about, look to Jesus. Don't look to yourself. Look to Jesus. He's the standard against which we should measure everything. So this is the fundamental insight of our Christian anthropology. True humanity is revealed not in us because we have a broken humanity. True humanity is revealed in Jesus. At the heart of this anthropology too is our belief that it is in the complementarity of man and woman, given to each other in mutual and lasting fidelity, that the vocation of humanity to be the image and likeness of the creative, life-giving God is most visibly recognised and realised. That's really important. Those of you who have looked at John Paul II's theology of the body will understand this very well. The complementarity of man and woman and their capacity to together bring life is where our vocation as human beings to be the image and likeness of the God who is the creator and life giver is most clearly manifested. It's not the only place it's manifested, but it's where it's most clearly manifested. So Pope Francis reflects on all of this and invites us to enter into the mystery of the triune God, a God of community, a God of self-giving and receiving from other, as the place where we'll understand what it is to be truly human. But in this first chapter, Pope Francis will also then begin to reflect on the entry of sin into this story, and much of this is the Pope's reflection on how we deal with this tragedy of sin which has come in and so distorted what human life is meant to be all about. How do we deal with it? We can't pretend it's not there. We can't pretend that it's a simple matter. How do we deal with the reality of the brokenness and sinfulness of humanity? Chapter 2 turns to many of the consequences of this tragedy of sin in our world. And amongst the many things that the Pope will say, one that jumped out at me was his identifying of what he calls an overly individualistic culture, caught up with possessions and pleasure. And he sees this as a clear sign of the infiltration of evil into our individual and communal lives. And then he takes an interesting step. He invites us as members of the church to reflect on how we in our church life have contributed to the distortion and the misunderstanding and the difficulties we all have in living out our vocation to be the image and likeness of God. And again, he returns to this idea of humility. Pope Francis is very strong on the importance of the virtue of humility. So he writes, we also need to be humble and realistic, acknowledging that at times the way we present our Christian beliefs and treat other people has helped contribute to today's problematic situation. We need a healthy dose of self-criticism. And some of us aren't all that good at self-criticism because it's uncomfortable, but we have to be brave enough to do it. And then he makes another point. This is in paragraphs 36 and 37 for those who want to chase it down later. We have long thought that simply by stressing doctrinal, bioethical and moral issues without encouraging openness to grace, we were providing sufficient support to families strengthening the marriage bond and giving meaning to marital life. Here's a challenge for anybody who's involved in any kind of pastoral ministry. We must make sure that encouraging openness to grace, facilitating growth in grace, facilitating a deeper relationship with the Lord has to be the heart of our pastoral efforts. Otherwise, telling people what the doctrines are, telling people what the ethical principles are, important though that is, will never lead on its own to the conversion that we all need. I think it's a really important point that he makes. He's not suggesting that we shouldn't present the doctrinal or bioethical or moral issues. They're essential aspects of a life lived with integrity, but we would be fooling ourselves if we thought that that was enough on its own. Christian marriage, and he's talking about marriage and family, Christian marriage is a vocation. And like any vocation, fidelity will only be sustained through an openness to the grace of God. Tom, how are we going for time?
Very well.
Oh, okay. I'll keep going. Chapter 3, Pope Francis turns once again to Jesus Christ. And it's the natural step for him to take, given his insistence that we need to do more for married couples and families than simply instruct them on their moral obligations. We need to help them discover that the source of the fidelity that they want to live will ultimately be found in Christ, in the communion of the church. And then, it's in this chapter that Pope Francis turns to one of his most favourite preoccupations or themes, and that is the theme of accompaniment and support. How are we, and when he says we, he's not just talking about bishops and priests and religious, he's talking about all of us. How are we as the Christian community going to assist and accompany and support those who are not, for a whole variety of reasons, yet able to live the fullness of married life as the church understands it? How are we going to deal with the reality whilst keeping our eyes on the ideal? This is a major challenge for the church in every aspect of its life, and I would think for each one of us individually in every aspect of our own lives. How am I going to hold together the call to the ideal and the messy, broken, damaged reality that I have to cope with? And how am I going to help other people to do the same? The Pope hints at a possible approach, which he will amplify a little bit later in the document. But here in chapter 3, he turns to John Paul II's Familiaris Consortio, which was John Paul II's Apostolic Exhortation after a previous synod on marriage and the family, I think. In paragraph 84 of Familiaris Consortio, Pope John Paul II says this: "When faced with difficult situations and wounded families, it is always necessary to recall this general principle. Pastors must know that for the sake of truth, they are obliged to exercise careful discernment of situations." So for Pope Francis, the idea of a careful discernment of situations means that you don't just rush in too quickly, you take time to understand the complexity of the situation. And then Pope Francis takes this a little bit further, and this is one of those things that leaves some people a little unsure, but I would suggest, and I'll say a little bit about it, he's actually just drawing on one of the most deeply grounded traditions of the church in moral theology. Pope Francis goes on to say, he's talking about difficult situations, people who aren't living the ideal. The degree of responsibility is not equal in all cases, and factors may exist which limit the ability to make a decision. Therefore, while clearly stating the Church's teaching, pastors are to avoid judgments that do not take into account the complexity of various situations, and they are to be attentive by necessity to how people experience and endure distress because of their condition. He's asking for that pastoral heart which understands that people are enduring distress. They're suffering through these things. They need to be approached and helped with compassion. Chapter 4 is where the Pope provides a sustained reflection on the nature of human love. Many of you will have read this beautiful chapter, and people have commented that this would make a fantastic program for a pre-marriage course, and suggested that maybe we should all update our pre-marriage courses by having a look at chapter 4 of Amoris Laetitia. I think it would also be a wonderful basis for a post-marriage course. It's a reflection in some respects on the famous hymn to love in Paul's letter to the Corinthians. We don't have this time to do this now, but I think that even here, what the Pope is doing is putting before married couples and families the high ideals of the Christian vocation. That's the role, one of the roles of the church, to put before people the high ideals of the Christian vocation. But if the church is going to do that, and it must, the church must also help people to manage the broken reality in which they find themselves, in which they recognise a big gap between the high ideals here and the reality of where they are at the moment. It's not always possible to go from here to here in one jump. And Pope Benedict has reflected on these kinds of issues at different times as well. Chapter 5, the Pope turns to the relationship between marriage and the family. And I think this is a very important chapter for us to consider, particularly given some of the issues that we're facing here in Western Australia at the moment and in Australia more generally. It's a chapter which reflects on in terms of our present context, the relationship between marriage and family, which the Catholic tradition just takes for granted, but which is no longer taken for granted in much of our society. We just think instinctively that marriage and family are two things that go together. But we know that we live in a society where many young couples choose marriage and deliberately make a decision that they don't want to have children, and yet they still marry. So there's been a break in what we would have always considered an unbreakable set of concepts. Marriage in our society is no longer instinctively understood as linked to family. That's a big challenge. And I think chapter 5 might help us try and delve into that challenge a little bit more. Within chapter 5 also, from paragraphs 172 to 177, there's a very important reflection on the unique and essential contributions that both mothers and fathers make to the upbringing of their children and to the well-being of their children. And this too is a real challenge in our society, where we're looking at establishing situations where we deliberately create families where it is impossible for there to be a mother and a father. This is a big challenge for us in our present situation. So I think some of these chapters of Amoris Laetitia have a lot of practical things to offer us in terms of our deeper reflection on these issues. Chapter 6, the Pope reflects on many pastoral situations, challenges and difficulties to which the Church is called to respond in relationship to marriage and family. And again, he returns to the idea that while we must continue to proclaim the Church's teaching, there's always more to do than simply that. Because we're dealing not just with people's heads, where they can perhaps grasp the logical side of the teaching, we're dealing with their hearts and their lives. Chapter 7 is important too. It focuses on the education in children, and particularly on the fundamental right and obligation and privilege of parents to be the first educators of their children. And he has an interesting reflection on family life, where he says that's the place where you learn to break out of your self-absorption and understand what it means to have responsibility for other people as well. as I was reading this and reflecting it, and of course I'm not married and I don't have a family. Well, I have a family, but not one that I'm living with all the time. That doesn't come out right. You know what I mean. You know what I mean. My brother and his wife and daughter are my family. They're on the other side of the country. I don't see them that often. That's what I mean. I think the Pope has an interesting reflection on this whole business, because I think he's inviting us, inviting each married couple, each family, but our society too, to ask ourselves about whether we're structuring family life in such a way as to enable our children to grow in this atmosphere of learning how to live and relate to each other and care for each other. If we never see our children because we're so busy with work, how well are we creating a structure in which children can grow and develop in a holistic way? So these are some of the things that the Pope raises. He also has a little bit to say about the importance of sex education and about the need to make sure that children grow up understanding the essential link between our sexual instincts and our need and desire to love and be loved. That's also a challenging message in the kind of world in which we live at the moment. So parents carry a great burden of responsibility, obviously.